All right, welcome back to the Couch GM podcast. We're doing a live podcast with Gary Hill Jr. tonight. So, first off, Gary, really appreciate you taking the time out of your extremely busy spring training schedule to join me on the live stream.
No problem. Well, it's packing day, so we're getting close to the end here. We're getting towards the finish line. So happy to be here.
So, yeah, I wanted to kind of go through a preview of the 2024 season for the Mariners. I've made a series of Mariners preview videos, including the lineup, the bullpen, and the starting rotation. So, I wanted to kind of go just, chunk by chunk and preview what you've seen at spring training, what there is of note, and what we expect for this year. Let's start off with the starting rotation. It's going to be one of the best rotations in baseball. I don't think there's any debating that part of it. In my video, I was thinking this very well could be the best rotation that the Mariners have seen in their history. I want to get your thoughts on that, and then comparing it to other all-time rotations that you've seen.
I think that statement's right on. I don't think there's any question about it. When not only do you have the star power at the front of the rotation, but the depth as well, and that combo has never existed for the Mariners, and that rarely exists for anybody. This rotation is incredible. If you start thinking about, if you were to power rank what the AL Cy Young Award chase looks like, and just kind of, especially when you knock Cole out of the mix too, and you start thinking about, okay, who are the contenders for this award? And man, like Castillo and Kirby in the top 10, both of them, and Gilbert. I don't know where you end up putting Gilbert, but 15-ish if it fluctuates depending on the person. But that's the kind of rotation that we're talking about. They, I think, have the best three in Major League Baseball. And the question for me is, when you look at the two youngsters with Wu and Miller, can they take that next step this year? And for me, the next step is, okay, what do they do against lefties this year? Because they're both very different pitchers, but they kind of have the
Mm-hmm.
same issue in terms of splits. Now Wu is more, it's heavier with Wu than it is with Miller, so he's got a longer ways to go with that. But if you can think about them just fighting a chunk out of lefties this year, bringing the slug down a little bit and the average down a little bit and that sort of thing, that would be a big step for those guys, because with their fastballs, I think they're still going to have a lot of success against righties. And if they can start handling lefties a little bit better, and then you start thinking about what that looks like with the top three, because I think Kirby still has a step he can go. I think Gilbert still has a step he can go. In fact, I think this year we're going to see Gilbert's numbers more reflect of the pitcher he is. I, I thought he was better last year than the year before. I don't think the surface numbers reflected that, but I think they have a chance to do that this year. He's a more complete pitcher than I think he's ever been. And I think Castillo is in his absolute prime, and he's a Cy Young contender. So you roll all of that into one, and with health, you get a chance to win every game. And when you start looking at matchups night after night after night, it's like, okay, Mariners have the advantage here on the mound, and tomorrow, and the next day. It's not going to be that way every night, but you start rolling out the rotation, you're going to have the advantage a lot of nights. That's a good place to start for any team.
Absolutely. I mean, unless you're going against the Braves and Striders on the mound or the Phillies and Wheelers on the mound, then you might have a debate there. But the Mariners 1 through 5, and MLB actually came out with their rankings, ranking the top rotations in the league, and the Mariners were on the top of their list today. Castillo, Kirby, and Gilbert all had ERAs ranging from 3.34 to 3.73, an ERA plus ranging from 108 to 121, so averaging 8 to 21% better than the average pitcher as far as ERA. All three of those guys had 190 innings pitched. And then you talk about, as you mentioned, Bryce Miller and Brian Wu. And then there's the sixth guy in Emerson Hancock that some people tend to forget about. He was a former first round pick. What have you seen from Emerson Hancock this spring? I've heard that he's looking healthy and looking pretty good.
Yeah, he pitched today. I wish I had a chance to see it. It was split squad today, and he pitched at Arizona. We got a chance to see Castillo, which was great. So uh, it's been interesting, especially when he started spring, because his velo was up, which was really interesting. And when you start to think about Emerson with upper velo, that's kind of a game changer for him. Really curious to see how things go wherever he ends up to start the season, because as you point out, they're not going to go through the season with five guys. Five guys aren't going to start through the year, and Hancock's going to be the first one up. So they're going to need him. He is going to pitch in a Mariners uniform this year, and he, I think, is at the point where he can take the next step. We're talking to Scott Service, who is really bullish on where Emerson Hancock is right now, and he really likes where his stuff is at and where he is mentally as well. So he feels really good about Hancock stepping in. It's hard to say. I just haven't seen him pitch that much. He was briefly up with the Mariners. I've seen him in spring a few times. So I'm anxious to see what it looks like over the longer period of time. But I think the most important thing is he's healthy to start the year, which is great because that's been one of the bigger struggles for him. He just hasn't been healthy over time. And I realized I hadn't thought about, or I didn't answer your question about where this team fits historically. Uh, and they've had great 1-2 punches before. I think when Felix was Felix and Iwakuma was at the top of his game, that was a great 1-2. Cliff Lee for a short time with Felix was a great 1-2. There's never Randy Johnson, of course, is a 1, and then you could slip in just about anyone after the 2. But there's never been anything like this, in my opinion. There's never been a threesome or certainly a 5-some like this, which is pretty incredible. So I don't think there's a good comparison in Mariners history. I think this for sure has the best opportunity to be the best rotation in Mariners history.
Absolutely. And then add on top of it, Logan Gilbert, he's coming in with not 1, but 3 fastballs this year. He threw the sinker a few times last year, but mainly that 4-seam. Apparently, he's been working on a cutter this offseason. I heard him say to Pitching Ninja that Cal Raleigh said his sinker sucks. So I'm not sure if he's going to be keeping that sinker, but he at least came into camp with 3 fastballs. And then I also saw that he re-gripped his splitter a bit because last year he was still pronating, similar to the changeup. But with this new grip, it's going to allow him to really just stay behind the ball and throw it like a fastball. So we might even see improvement in his splitter this year compared to last year.
To your point about the 2-seam, it's funny. I feel like he's been wrestling with that the last couple of years, and I would not be surprised if we don't see that during the regular season. It's funny. I was calling the game the other day, and in Peoria, we don't have Statcast, so it's which I can't stand because I feel like I'm doing the game blind. Right? We have just our eyes for what's going on, which is really tricky sometimes when we know guys are working on pitches, and sometimes it's a guess. Like, because some breaking balls are pretty similar in velo, and some are pretty similar in movement, especially when a guy's working on something you've never seen it before.
Yeah.
So I'm just going along calling a Gilbert start, and he strikes out a dude on a pitch upstairs. The velo was like 90, and it looks straight-ish. I'm like, what? I call it strikeout, whatever. And then we go into break, and I'm like, what was that? And then that was it. That was the cutter the first time I saw it. So we've seen it a few times, and it's been pretty effective. It's just funny in spring training how it goes sometimes, where you're just looking. Sometimes you're looking for a pitch. Like, I've been anxious to watch Thornton every time he pitches because I know he's working on a splitter. And that's easier to tell because of the movement. But sometimes, like a cutter, it's really hard to differentiate, especially when you don't know it's coming. So it's always interesting down here, to say the least.
Have we seen a Kirby knuckleball this spring?
He's thrown one that I know of
Did he?
for sure. Yeah, he threw it to Mike Ford, who
yesterday?
No, this was earlier in the spring against Cincinnati.
Okay.
And he got a base hit on the knuckleball. So I know he's thrown at least one. I'm anxious to see if we're going to see that in the regular season ever. He's got so many other weapons. It's hard. Like, what scenario? Maybe a 6-0 lead sometime. You just kind of throw it in there. But I know Scott's not a big fan of it, Scott Service, but I know I want to see it from time to time. I think it's great.
That could be a first pitch of the game type thing.
Yes.
They're expecting 97, and then here's a knuckleball.
And here it is. Yep. Yeah, hit this. I love it.
That's awesome. Yeah, so now heading into the bullpen, they've added some big pieces this offseason in Gregory Santos. Of course, Jackson Kowar they added, and then, he's out for the year. Carlos Vargas was just sent down in AAA, but he's a guy with a lot of potential. And then, of course, Ryan Stanek was signed. There's other names throughout the bullpen, one being compared to Sewald and some other intriguing names. Who are you seeing in the bullpen that's piqued your interest?
I've done a lot of my work on the bullpen down here, mostly because the rest of the roster is pretty stable. So, it's fun to watch the young guys, Cole Young, Colton Emerson, things like that, getting my first chance to see guys like that day to day. But for like, okay, what's going to impact the season moving forward? I've done a lot of work on the bullpen, and partly because of what we've seen the last few years is we've seen, as you know, guys pop out of the bullpen seemingly out of nowhere. So I feel like when I go into spring, I got to be aware of every single one of these guys, whether a major league invite or a minor league invite, because you just never know at this point who's going to be. So some of the guys that stood out, you pointed out Vargas. I thought he was really impressive early in camp, and I can see him. Obviously, he's not going to make the club out of spring, but I could see how he could really help down the road. His stuff is wicked, and as much as the attention with the fastball gets, like his cutter is something else, and his slider's really good too. And if he can just harness it, and I know that's what they're working on, they're trying to get him more in the strike zone, especially in his role. He's going to be a guy that comes into games with guys on base, and Mariners hate walks, especially late in the game with guys on. You just can't have it. So that's going to be it. If he can harness that ability and just throw more strikes, he can be a real weapon down the road. So he really opened my eyes. Cody Bolton has been really impressive to me. We've seen him touch 97 with the fastball. That fastball is real. I talked to him about it too. He was a starter for a long time. Last year was his first full season in the bullpen. And he's had some tough luck. Like he had the COVID year, so he was knocked out. And then he had knee surgery, so 2 full years gone. So I feel like at the age, he's just not that experienced in the bullpen. Last year with Pittsburgh, he got recalled 7 times. He hasn't been settled the last few
That's
years. And
tough.
so I think, yeah, and I think this is a great landing spot for him. And he was super excited about being with the Mariners because, as we know, like bullpen guys especially have had a lot of success. That is not lost on other pitchers in Major League Baseball because they talk, they see it. Koar, who you mentioned off the bat, I'm pretty bummed about because he looked great to start spring. He was,
That changeup was
yeah,
insane.
man, and the fastball 98, and he was interesting to talk to too because kind of like Bolton, this guy was a starter his whole life, and he felt like now was the first time he figured out really how to be a bullpen guy, how to like air out the fastball. Like I'm only pitching inning, I don't have anything to save for 7 innings or so. And he was talking to Spire a ton because they were both teammates in Kansas City.
Hmm.
And it's so funny when you talk to these guys because we hear the message all the time, dominate the zone, that sort of thing. And we hear it from the coaching staff. Well, the players are spitting that right back. They believe in it. And for a guy like Spire, whose career changed completely after coming over to the Mariners and having success, like there's a lot of former Royals around camp right now. Snyder, who you didn't mention, is another one who's been really impressive. But they're all listening to it and they're buying in. So when I look at kind of long-winded answer to your question, when I look at kind of 2 bullpen spots open because of Brash gone and Santos gone to start the season, like to me, Bolton is in. I think he's going to make the team, and I think he has a chance to be a higher leverage type guy. And I think the other spot is going to come down to 2 guys. Snyder is one, whose stuff is really good, and Tyson Miller is the other. And I think he was the one you were referencing, the
The Paul
Seawald.
Sewald comp.
Yeah, there's been that. There's been Penn Murphy comparisons too, which is interesting. But he's the type of guy the Mariners have just had a lot of success with. It's that slot, coming from the right side. It's a familiar look when Mariners fans see him in person. And the sweeper's been really effective, and he's just pounding the zone. I talked to him about it too. He's a believer. He had a similar story last year where he bounced around everywhere. He was like 4 times up and down with the Brewers, and then to the Dodgers, then to the Mets, back to the Dodgers with all the AAA teams in between. He's like throwing the weighted ball against a hotel wall. It's just the real life part of it is brutal when you're not pitching. You don't know where you're going next. You're living out of hotels. So I think along the lines of Bolton, like coming to the Mariners is going to be big for him too. And he's bought in. I think he is, if he doesn't make the club out of spring, I think he'll be a factor this year. And he's a multiple inning guy too. We've seen him go 2 innings multiple times this year, which I think is pretty valuable, especially early in the season.
Yeah, and you mentioned, how tough that could be getting called up, sent back down, a guy getting called up 7 times or being traded to different teams. you're expected to be this reliever that comes into a game in a pressure situation and be mentally strong, but then you don't have any stability in your life, let
Yeah.
alone, in baseball in your role. I can only imagine, what some of these guys have gone through, and to be able to have an opportunity like this, although it hasn't been the best situation to where a spot open with Brash and Santos, starting on the IL, but now these guys have an opportunity to be in a designated spot to have their opportunity.
Yeah, it's the real life part that we never see. We see the transactions, we see a guy get called up, but sometimes you just don't know what they've gone through. And for Miller, it was really interesting to talk about just having such a hard time going days and days and days without pitching. And then you get called up and you have to be your best. I mean, how can you be your best when your routine has just been destroyed and you're having a hard time just finding a place to work out? You don't know where you're sleeping the next day. Things like that. The
Right.
real life part of it is really challenging, especially for bullpen guys, because they can really get on the shuttle up and down, especially if you're kind of that last guy, which Miller and Bolton both were. I'm impressed with any guy in that circumstance that can have success at that level, because you're facing the best hitters in the game on top of everything else. So good luck with all that.
Do we have a timeline for Gregory Santos and Matt Brash? I know Brash is on his throwing program. Santos isn't yet. Is that correct?
That's right. Brash has started to throw. He did a light bullpen the other day, not high intensity. Santos, I think they were taking another picture today, so hopefully we'll have some more news on that soon. But they're just waiting for that to calm down before he gets to a throwing program. If it's looks healed up, he'll start that soon. Santos probably won't be till May. If you kind of think about, you know, he's going to have to essentially have a spring training. He's starting over. Brash will have
Yeah.
to too, but Brash is ahead of Santos on the schedule. They haven't given a firm timeline because they just at this point it's just so hard to guess right now.
Too
They're
early.
being careful with both of them because they look at this as they need them this year. It's not worth rushing either of them back right now, which is
This is,
partly why Stanek was added to the mix too. And I think he's going to be a real important factor late in games.
yeah, it's a 162 game season.
Yeah.
As everyone's talked about a lot this spring training. Those games in April are just as important as later in the year, but you want those guys to be there later in the year for when that crunch time comes. You mentioned Ryan Stanek. I listened to your interview with him, and I it's not what I was expecting either. We've
It's
seen
so
this guy in the Houston uniform the past few years. This big, intimidating guy with this long hair and throws 100 miles an hour with a splitter. He seems like a great guy, really nice guy. What was your experience with Stanek, and what have you seen from him so far?
he's a great dude, which is so funny because I've seen him pitch 1,000 times against the Mariners, right? And he's been the ultimate enemy. He's been on the Astros, and he's got that look, the hair, the beard, the
Right.
whole thing. And he's massive. He's just a massive human being, and he looks mean on the mound. And then you talk to him, and he is nothing like that at all. I found him to be a wonderful guy, and it's funny because he talked about the only time he's really angry is on the mound. So he took it as a compliment, which is great. I guess that's how I'd want opponents to look at me too. I'd want them to think that I'm a big mean guy on the mound. So, but he's great, and for a guy that's been around, what really impressed me is he's all in with the Mariners stuff too. In fact, he's not just a guy coming here saying, "Hey, I do my thing. I'm going to go out. I'm going to throw 100 and throw the splitter, and I'm going to be good." Like he's looking for the Mariners to turn a dial or two or help him get better, which I thought that was really great to hear for a guy that's been really established. He's been a really good reliever in this game. In fact, a couple of years ago had a great year, especially on the surface numbers were pretty ridiculous. So I thought that was pretty cool, and I'm interested to see how that plays out. He's working on some stuff too, so I'm curious to see what that looks like. We've seen a couple of times in spring so far, and he's throwing 98, 99. He's going to be ready for the season.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean the starting rotation is going to be one of the best in baseball. The bullpen, fully healthy, is going to be one of the best in baseball. Great start to the roster. If you're watching this live stream, make sure to comment below your questions for Gary and about the Mariners roster heading into 2024. Now getting into the Mariners lineup, there's been a ton of turnover this offseason. Some was maybe expected. There's been a lot that was just unseen as far as the moves that happened. 4 out of the 9 guys that will be written into the lineup on opening day were written into the lineup opening day last year. So basically a completely new lineup. What are your initial thoughts from seeing the lineup play throughout the spring with the depth that they've had? Mitch Haniger has been on fire. He looks healthy. What are your initial thoughts of this offense?
Yeah, so let me start with this. I am not a believer in spring stats. I'm not a believer in spring records. I don't think those matter when it gets to the regular season at all. Uh, so I'm kind of old school when it comes to spring training. As much of a data guy that I am during the regular season, spring training is more like, hey, they look really good. You know, it's funny how uh, that happens in spring, but just because there's so many variables when it comes to spring, it's hard to rely on any of the numbers. But I know talking to Scott and everyone around the team, what they are thrilled with are just the at bats during spring training. And what strikes me looking at the lineup play out, and I think it's been a perfect spring training in terms of what's happened with the lineup during spring because guys have played, they've looked good, they've stayed healthy, and knock on wood, there's 3 more games to go, 4 more games to go, however many. Uh, but it looks like they're going to take their starting lineup healthy into spring training, which to me was the ultimate goal of spring training. But when I watch it play out, what's striking to me is just how much deeper they're going to be. Like when you pencil out in your mind an opening day lineup for the Mariners. And we almost saw that today, I thought. It's the closest that we've seen an opening day starting lineup. And Ty France is batting seventh in that lineup.
Right.
And
Yeah.
to me, that really speaks to the quality of depth that they have over years past. And I think they have a chance. You know, it's funny. I don't think their offense was bad last year. Like WRC Plus, they were top 10 in baseball. I just think it was wildly inconsistent, right? There'd be like August, they were on fire. They were great. Nothing could go wrong. But they would have other stretches where they weren't good. They weren't good. And
Bases
so,
loaded, no outs, can't score a
yeah, and
run.
it just felt like it was these huge peaks and valleys during the course of the season. I feel like this version of the Mariners offense has a chance to be more consistent through the course of the season. And what has been really striking to me, especially behind the scenes, is the Garver and Polanco in particular and how much they can factor into this, not only with their production on the field, but man, the things they bring behind the scenes. Like Polanco is a worker. He is regimented. He's a veteran. He's been in this game a long time, and he gets after it. He's like Mitch Haniger in the way. It's funny when you go to the clubhouse, like you never see those guys because they're always off doing something, and that's Polanco. Uh, quiet guy, but he just goes about his business. Garver is super smart when it comes about hitting. He is very aware of himself and his skill set and how it plays in Major League Baseball. And he's super smart about other pitchers and what they're trying to do. In fact, it was fun to talk to him about the Mariners pitching staff and kind of the insights he gave us when he was on the other side. And to have him in the middle of the order and what I think are good. I mean, we know what he is. Like to me, he's kind of when the Mariners talk about dominating the zone and what they want, Garver's it. That's
Hmm.
what he does. He's got a great eye and he's looking to punish pitches. To me, he's the perfect fourth batter. And it's funny, you talk about the new guys in the lineup. Blanco 3, Garver 4. I mean, they have a brand new middle of the order. And I think those 2 guys are going to be huge for them. The key, though, and I'm not alone in this, is how healthy can they stay? How many games will Garver and Polanco and Haniger give them? And I don't think all of them are going to get through the season unscathed. Like guys are going to go on the IL. But when I look at the offense, I think the key for me is hey, don't lose 2 or 3 of those guys at the same time for multi weeks because that's when I think they get into trouble. I think they have more depth than they've had in years past. But if you start knocking out Garver, Polanco, Haniger at the same time for like a 3 week stretch, I think that's where they get into trouble.
Absolutely. Yeah, you speak to the depth. One of the guys that's going to be on the bench opening day is one of Canzone or Rayleigh, depending on which way they go. You look at, I mean, last year's opening lineup, you had Blistella, and some other guys that were shouldn't even maybe be on a roster, but just the depth. And you speak to the work that Polanco puts in. Add to it the fact that he's a switch hitter. He's got to do the work from both sides of the plate. And I've heard behind the scenes of how much Mitch Haniger works,
Mhm.
and I can only imagine how much that's going to rub off on those younger guys. You mentioned that you're not a fan of stats in spring training. So, what do you make of Luke Rayleigh's spring training so far?
It's so funny. I don't care. Like, okay, let me say this. I think it's better if the guys feel good about themselves going into the regular season, right? Like that. I think confidence is great. And I know he's had some struggles along the way, but yeah, JP is a great example. Last year, he had an awful spring, like truly awful spring, and he turned in outside of Alex Rodriguez like the best season from a Mariners shortstop ever. I just think there's no predicting what you see in spring. There's no translation to me from spring training to the regular season, especially with veterans. Now you can argue Luke Raley is not quite at the veteran status, which okay, I'll accept that. Like he had a full year in the majors last year, but he hasn't had a ton of major league time. But when I look at veterans, like if Julio goes 4 for 50 or 30 for 50 in spring training. I'm like, it doesn't matter. Either way, he's going to bat second in the lineup on opening day, and that's all forgotten with the first pitch he sees. So uh, I'm not worried about it. I am curious to see how it plays out because you look at opening day, Julio is going to be in center. Garver's your DH, and I'm guessing Haniger is going to be in right. So who does draw that opening start? It's probably going to be Canzone.
Right.
And I'm curious how this thing plays out. Will Canzone and Rayleigh both be platooned as we move through the season? So it's like Haniger and Dylan Moore. Is he going to be the left fielder, or is one of those guys going to hit against lefties? I look at the outfield as kind of four instead of three because Haniger's he's gonna have built-in days off. So there's gonna be a lot of days where we see Rayleigh uh, and Canzone because I think to get Haniger through a season, like you've got to build those days in, and a lot of like day games after night games. I think there's going to be natural spots to give Haniger some rest. So I think they will both hit. They'll both get playing time, but I'm just curious to see how it kind of shakes out. And the same thing with third base. Like I don't feel like that will necessarily be a straight platoon, but I don't know what it's going to look like at all. So we'll see.
Yeah, and because if it's going to be a platoon in the outfield, then you would assume that it would be based off of handedness. So
Mm-hmm.
if there's a majority of the pitchers are going to be right-handed, are the lefties going to get most of the starts in the outfield? Even though Haniger, he does hit righties also. And then with the health thing, Mitch Garver, if I'm the manager, the GM, he's not touching a catcher's glove because if he can stay healthy and play in 120, 130 games, that you can get solid production out of Garver. And then with Haniger, you mentioned that there's going to be natural days that he's going to have off. What would you predict, or how many games a week would you predict Haniger is going to be on that lineup?
Boy, that's a great question. I think part of it will depend on matchups, but 5 of 7, that's just a guess. I really think they want to get him through the season, and I think they're
Right.
eyes wide open about how to do it. And they did it a couple years ago, but they had the DH to do it, and they don't have the DH this year because, to your point, they know how valuable Garver's bat is in the lineup. So Garver is going to be the DH, and they said maybe he'll catch a couple of games during the season. We've seen him catch one time in spring for like 4 innings. It is interesting. He is acting as a catcher in that he goes through all the meetings. Like he's with Cal and Sebi when they go through all the meetings talking about pitching, which I think, getting back to what I said earlier, like he is a super smart guy when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
opposition. So I think it's really valuable to have him in those conversations. I think that part's great. But I'm with you. Like to get him through a season because all his injuries. You look at his injury history. It's all because it
Yeah,
was always catching. So if you
it's
can
because that's the
just,
most dangerous position on the field.
it is, it is. It's a brutal position, and the fact that Cal just soldiers through all these things is truly amazing. Like the thumb thing, I will never get over because that was absurd. Uh, but yeah, if they can just, and I'm actually confident in this. If he's just a DH, I feel pretty good about him getting through the majority of the season. But that does make it tough on the Haniger side. So I'm curious about it. But 5 of 7 would be my guess right now, and especially when you have Rayleigh and Canzone both healthy at the same time, you have an option to go to, which is great. It's not like years past. I felt like they've had a hard time even when guys needed days. First of all, they've struggled to start the season. So it felt like the last 3 years, they've always been chasing 5 games, 7 games, 8 games, right? And always trying to get back. And so they've been limited on when they can give guys days off. And they haven't necessarily had the depth to consistently give guys days off. And I feel like with a healthy team that they have right now, they have an opportunity to do both those things, which could really help.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then I guess one other comment on that position and the whole platoon is that I've heard in Luke Rayleigh's prior interviews, in prior years with the Dodgers and with the Rays, that the inconsistency of at bats never allowed him to really take that next step and make that adjustment at the big league level. So it's like, yeah, how many games do you play Mitch Haniger to try to keep him healthy throughout the season? And then at the same time, you want to try to give Canzone and Rayleigh all of the at bats that they can so that they can take that next step and that they're not trying to figure it out when you do end up needing them. So that
Yeah,
it's great to have the depth there, but then also figuring out how to solve that Rubik's Cube.
the Rubik's Cube is a perfect way to put it. And Scott and his staff, working with the health department as well with the Mariners, they'll have their hands full trying to figure all that out. But it kind of it's almost like a bullpen situation too in a lot of ways. You're always trying to manipulate that and figure that out. And the Mariners have been really
Mm-hmm.
good at that the past few years. So I'm anxious to see how it works out. But it's a good problem to have, that's for sure. It's a problem they haven't had very often the last few years.
Yeah. And then speaking to the bench positions, so as we mentioned, one of those corner outfielders is going to start on the bench. Then you've got Sam Haggerty, you've got Dylan Moore, and Sebi Zavala. I'm curious, which prospect do you think at some point this year will come up, and if there might be someone filled in that utility infield role, if a Ryan Bliss or a Tyler Locklear or some of these other guys, could we see potentially Cole Young later in the year or Harry Ford back up at catcher later in the year? What are your thoughts on some of these younger guys that are right there at the doorstep?
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. Part of it obviously will be who they're replacing. Like if Ty France were out, if it's June and he's out for a few weeks and Tyler Locklear is raking, yeah, I could 100% see that. That would be the natural spot for him. In fact, going into spring, I asked Justin Hollander kind of who's on the radar in terms of young guys to make that first leap forward, and he talked about Tyler Locklear as being one of those guys because he can just hit. So I'm curious to see how his minor league season starts. Cole Young, I would have said going into spring, no way. Watching how spring played out and watching him, I'm like, okay, I wouldn't say right off the bat, but maybe later in the season he could come up and help if he needed him, which I think is a pretty wild thing to say at 20 years old, but he was really impressive. And I know it's spring training, but he just looked like he belonged. And he was playing against a lot of major leaguers to start. He was playing nearly every day to start spring. They were really giving him a lot of reps, but he was impressive. Harry Ford was impressive too. He's got all the skills and all the talent. If Cal were to go down for any length of time, it would be something to think about because back to our earlier point, I don't think you want to play Garver a ton. And Sebi there, I know they have Papirski, who's kind of a guy who's been around a little bit, and they've liked what he's done this spring. But for a longer term situation, like Harry Ford has the skills, I'm curious. I don't think it would be something they do early in the year, but maybe see how his year plays out, and he could help at the end. Now, the infield's interesting. Ryan Bliss has been really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know they want him to work more at shortstop too to see what that looks like. They feel like he has some work to do there, but he's been pretty solid at second base. He seems like he is an option that could help in a lot of ways sooner rather than later. Samad Taylor, I think, is a guy they would go to in a platoon situation. if Haggerty didn't start the season, for example, maybe Samad Taylor's a guy that ends up on the roster sooner rather than later, simply because, man, he's a perfect guy to have on the bench because he can literally play anywhere. He told me he'd catch if he had to. He grew up as a catcher of all things, but he's a guy that's played all infield, all outfield positions. He can steal a bag off the bench. He's kind of just a great guy to have at the end of the bench. So I think he's somebody that could help in a utility role. But young guys have been super interesting, and take going a step lower, like the Farmelos, the Colt Emersons. That's a super exciting group. We've gotten some glimpses of them through, but just athletic, fun. Throw Montas into that too. We've seen him, especially in this later stages of spring, more often. But man, it looks like the Mariners have a lot of offense coming, and it could be coming sooner rather than later.
I've heard Farmelo being referred to as the Ferrari.
Yes, coaching staff calls him the Ferrari, which I think is great.
That power speed, he looks like a true five-tool guy.
Yeah, we haven't seen him a ton, but what we've seen has been really impressive. He's homered. He's made a great catch, splatting against the wall. He is just tooled out, and once he figures it out, he's got a chance to be really, really good.
And then Colt Emerson, I heard Dipoto in one of his interviews talking about the potential of Colt Emerson making his debut while he's still a teenager, potentially, or when he's 20 years old. I mean, can we see Colt Emerson in Seattle next year playing third base?
That is just, I mean, I wouldn't rule anything out. It seems ridiculous on its surface. It's funny because I just saw him in the hallway a couple days ago and was talking to him, and I mean, he's 18. He's 18. So I don't think it's fair to put that on him to say, we could see him at 19, but they love him. They love what he does. They love his ability to hit. And he's got the chance to be a really fast mover. And I know part of when they drafted him, he was 17 at the time, just raking at the
Really
time.
young for his draft class.
Super young, yeah, which uh, made him even more impressive when it comes to the draft. So I'm really anxious to see how his year plays out. He's got a chance to have a big year, and I'm so anxious to see, like, okay, how long does he stay at one level? Like, how fast is he going to move? And that being said, he's 18. It's I mean, there's high schoolers that are 18, and here he
Yeah.
is. It's so wild. He's in some of these spring training games going against 35-year-old vets. It's wild.
Yeah. Big leaguers face. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just, I could only imagine, especially I could only imagine trying to catch some of these guys like Munoz with the 100-mile-an-hour sinker, especially Cal with like a, torn ligament in his thumb doing it, let alone trying to barrel up one of these guys.
Oh,
It's nearly impossible to hit a baseball.
the other day, it's so fun when you're at the spring training facility because the bullpens are just right out in the open and you can just stand and watch and get really close to watching these bullpens. And, I watched a Munoz one the other day. I don't understand how anyone hits it. I really don't. He's an alien. I don't get it. His stuff is just unbelievable. He is just from a different planet because the stuff is unbelievable. He's looked great. In fact, if I had to say who has been most impressive in camp, man, Munoz is it for me.
Really?
He came out. His first pitch was 99. We've seen him touch 101. Slider's been filthy. I know he's talked about this is as healthy as he's felt in a long time. He really struggled with a couple of things last year. He is completely healthy, and he is showing it because he's looked great. So, with the other bullpen issues too, that's huge. I think for the Mariners because at least because I think he's going to be ninth inning guy mostly with the way things are set up right now. If you can get it there with the lead, like he's going to lock it down. You just have to get it there right now. And I think there's going to be a lot of mix and match, righty lefty, stand expire, that sort of thing to try and get it there. And it's going to be tricky at times, especially early in the season. But if you can get it there, I'm pretty confident he's going to close it down.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And I was interviewing him on the sidelines last year, and he started the season, I believe, on the IL. He had the surgery on his foot, and when I was asking him about, this is when he came up to the big leagues, back to being fully healthy. He had some down outings, you could say, and he was telling me that he just wasn't mentally there yet because he didn't have that spring training. He wasn't used to being in the big stadium yet, and having to build up in that environment was tough. So for him to be coming into the spring training fully healthy, ready to go, I mean that's huge for the bullpen, especially like as you mentioned with the health.
It is huge for the bullpen, and it's funny because you look back at his last year, and it was a good year. I mean, it was not a bad year by any means, but you compare it to the year before where he was utterly dominant, just crushing opponents. So he raised the bar for himself at such a ridiculous level. It was hard to match, but I feel like he's going to have that kind of year again, which would be huge for the Mariners, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah, so guys, if you're watching the live stream, if you have any questions for Gary, make sure to comment. We'll get to some questions here. So one is coming from Army Chow Mein. A question for Gary. What is your favorite part about reporting about the Mariners, and what is something you wish could change about the way MLB operates if you were a GM for a day?
Hmm. What I love is this is what I've always wanted to do, broadcast for the Seattle Mariners. So, I mean, that's on its face. That's it. I mean, this is what I've always wanted to do since I was little kid me. So the fact that I'm here, like I'm at spring training, I go to the clubhouse every day, talk to the guys, call the games. I mean, that's it. I'm living the life that I was hoping to live. So I guess that's a really easy one. Change the way MLB operates if I were GM for a day. Boy, that's a tough one.
And a follow up, I would ask about the new rules this year on top of
Oh,
the ones from last year.
it's funny. Aaron Goldsmith and I were just talking about the new rules today because he had a great conversation with Perry Hill about the new rules, especially the second blocking at second base, for example, like blocking the runner.
Right.
Actually, makes a lot of sense to me because hey, you're not supposed to run over the guy, right? So the runner can't run over the guy at the bag. So if the guy's blocking the bag completely, the runner's left with no option. So in in just fairness, I like that rule change. I think it. I think at times it's going to be tricky because as far as I understand it, it's not going to be. You can't review it on replay, which so it's going to be a judgment call in real time. Which, as fast as everyone is, as fast as the action goes, I think inevitably there's going to be times where, well, that wasn't the right call. That looks bad, but I love the spirit of it, and it's the same. When MLB changed catchers being run over, disallowed that. I was a huge fan of that because at the end of the day, for me, is I want to see the stars play. I want to see the great players play, and so I don't want to see guys get hurt on the catcher gets run over at home plate
Football
or
plays,
yeah, like I'm not into
being
that.
out,
I want to see
concussions. Yeah.
yeah, and we've seen guys get seriously hurt, like out for years at a time with stuff like that. And same thing with first base. Like I like that they've widened it and kind of defined what it means to run down the first base line, which has always been kind of nebulous. So I guess they've finally determined what exactly that is, running down the first base line. So I like all the safety enhancements, bigger bags. I'm a big fan of all that stuff because
Yeah.
I want to see the guys play. I don't like seeing guys get hurt. There's enough injury in the game as it is. That's just part of it without collisions and all the other stuff that goes with it.
Yeah, and this offseason they expanded the running lane down first base. So instead of just having to be on the right side, you could also be anywhere in the dirt and not be called out.
Yeah, which is helpful. I know one thing I would change. This is such a minute thing, but I think it'd be great. It's more of a stat thing. I would like to change stolen bases to make it a plus minus stat. So, because a guy can steal 20 bags, right? But if he got thrown out 10 times
Oh,
compared to the other
interesting.
guy who got thrown out twice, like give me the guy with the plus 18 or the guy with the plus 10. So small thing, but I would like to see, like when you go to Fangraphs or whatever, you see the SB. It's great, but I want to see the plus minus. That's where I'm at. Because at some
That ma-
point, if you get thrown out too often, you're hurting more than you're helping.
it's a net negative. Yeah, I mean, if you're stealing a lot of bases but you get thrown out a ton, are you
Yeah,
really helping
and
the
I
team
feel
all
like
that
the
much?
running game is going to only increase now. I thought we saw it last year balloon a little bit, and I think teams are catching on too and are going to try and run even more and employ guys who run even more. So I think it's going to be even more prevalent the next couple of years.
And then this question from Reflect the Sun leads into another rule change from this year. They sped up the pitch clock even more. So there were 1,013 more steals apparently in 2023 than 2022. Do you think that the Mariners will run as much or more this year with the time clock being changed again?
So I think that all relies on personnel. Uh, it's funny, they have a lot of guys in spring that have done it, but you look at Class A and Bliss and Taylor, you got on the list, and those guys, for the most part, aren't going to be with the Mariners to start the season. So the question is, do the Mariners have the personnel to take advantage right now of that? And some guys, like Julio, can obviously steal a bunch of bags, but a guy like Garver isn't going to swipe a bunch of bags.
Or
So,
Haniger?
or Haniger, like they have a lot of guys like that. And so
Yeah.
I just think it's dependent on personnel more than anything else. And they have some guys that can do it, but I don't know. Luke Rayleigh's faster than you would think he'd be. Like he's a guy that can swipe some bags, but they're
He's a
not going to run
big guy.
wild.
Yeah.
Like you, just because the rules are different, like you're not going to give Cal Raleigh and Ty France and Mitch Carver, Mitch Haniger the green light, right? So they're kind of limited in that way because half or a little more than half of their lineup, like JP's not a fast guy either. Like he's not going to
Hmm.
swipe a bunch of bags. So they just don't have a lot of that.
And I've heard that there's a little bit of a competition between Cal Raleigh and Ty France on who gets the most stolen bases year in year out. So we'll see if one of them takes a risk to have the upper hand in the locker room.
Well, Cal has a spring training triple in stolen base, so he's off to a good start.
Yeah. And then I mean Ty France, the driveline effect. He's lost the weight. Everyone's talking about that. He's got some wheels on
Looks
him.
great.
He's been moving faster around the base path than we've really ever seen. I think.
There's two guys. It's funny when you don't see players for a length of time and you lay his eyes on them for the first time. There were two guys that I saw for the first time. It was like, whoa, they look different. Ty France was one. He just looks great. He looks slim down and great. And Dom Canzone is the other, who put on a lot of muscle, and it really shows. Like there's a kind of thing where you see him, it's like, wow, you have done a lot this offseason. So those two guys
Yeah.
really stood out.
Awesome. We'll get to our final question and then let you get off here. So Stack the Pack wants to know, what did you have to do to get the opportunity to be a broadcaster for the Mariners? For the people that haven't seen our podcast together.
Yeah, this is a long story, so I won't go through the whole story. But I went to school at Washington State, and they have a great broadcasting program there where they let us broadcast everything, football and basketball and volleyball and everything else for free, because every broadcaster is terrible to start. It's the kind of skill that you only get good by doing it, and it takes a long time to get any good at it. And you could argue that some like me aren't any good at it now. So, but that's how it started, and then it was just a real grind and a stair step along the way. Just a lot of different. I started calling NAIA basketball and Pac-10 baseball at the time, and Pac-12 baseball after that, and just kind of one job after another led to the Seattle SuperSonics, and then led to a fill-in with the Mariners, which led to a little more fill-in, and it was just really a long. I won't bore you with all the details, but a really long grind to get here. And I think at some point, the Kraken are new, but I think I've worked in one capacity or another with every pro team in the area, including Washington State, Storm, Sonics, Seahawks, Mariners. So uh, it took giving up sleep for couple calendar years, a few calendar years, and some luck along the way and some hard work. So yeah,
And
it's
how
if
many
you
years?
want the full
Yeah.
story, yeah, we talked about it in depth last time. So check out your previous podcast. It's a little more detail in that one.
Yeah, and a follow-up question. I'm curious what the rotation is for the broadcasters, Um, is there a set rotation of who's calling, TV versus radio? Is there a set, or is it just kind of who's available, who wants to fill in?
Rick's always on radio, and Aaron and Dave essentially flip flop during the course of the season. So that's how it's kind of set. And then
Gotcha.
I'm just in and out depending on what's going on.
Cool.
So that's basically how it's set. Spring training is just that's a whole different scenario. We're just all in and out randomly. So for the regular season is a little more structured.
Yeah. Well, Gary, really appreciate your time as always. Looking forward to this season. It's gonna be a lot of fun. I think they'll make a deep run this year. Really appreciate your time, everyone that's watching. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.